Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology here on Educator.com. This time around, we're going to be taking a look at the early history of psychology and looking at when psychology became a science and what the early science was looking like. So when we look at the history, we're going to be looking at early psychological science, two key fields called structuralism and functionalism, which are really no longer around anymore. Gestalt psychology, psychoanalysis, and behaviorism, we're going to be looking at a little bit later, but these three are going to be our main ones in this particular section. Remember that the history and approaches is 2 to 4% of your multiple choice section. So structuralism was roughly 1875 to the 1930s, and Wilhelm Wundt, love the German names, Wilhelm Wundt. He was the first psychologist, the first real honest-to-goodness, we have us a psychologist here. And he was working at Leipzig University in Germany, and he was doing a reaction time experiment, getting into some of the psychophysics. And so the idea is that 1879, Leipzig, Germany, Wilhelm Wundt created the first psych lab. And thus began the history of psychology. Some other people you need to know about include Edward Tichenor. He was the first U.S. psychologist, and he led the first real school or group of psychologists. Tichenor was impressed with the sciences such as chemistry, because what they were doing was doing things like breaking down complex things into simple things. For example, breaking down molecules into atoms. And they believed that that was a particularly important idea. The primary problem with structuralism was that they lacked reliability and validity of their methods. So some ideas that they used in structuralism. First, it was, as we know, it was an early approach, but it tried to identify the basic parts or the structure. So a word, a term that is using a word to define itself. It tried to examine the structure of the conscious mind. Structuralism, the structure of the conscious mind. And so what they were looking at is that if we are trying to think about what's going on in our conscious mind, in someone's head, we need to think of the small subjective unit of any concept. How do we get to that? And so this subjective unit for structuralists was known as the elementary elements of consciousness, the subjective unit. And to get to these subunits of consciousness, they used the method of introspection. Now, what they would do is, and this is a demonstration that I've used in class before, and what so to give you kind of an example would be, here's a piece of hard candy. I'd like you to put it in your mouth. I'd like you to describe to me what it tastes like. What is the flavor like? Does the flavor change as you are rolling it around in your mouth and over your tongue? Is anything happening to your tongue while you are eating this hard candy? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What is the texture of that particular thing? So they would ask the people to sit down and think and then describe. And so they trained people to be an observer and reflect on and analyze their mental experiences. Do you think just in that little process with the sucking on the hard candy, for you, is that going to be an effective way to understand what's going on in the mind? Wasn't for the structuralists either.